Heiko, thank you. Good afternoon. I'm delighted to be in Germany for this historic week. This morning, Foreign Minister Maas and I spent in Bodleroyd. We were vividly reminded of the painful separation that was caused by the wall. We saw guard towers, bunkers, and remains of the very structure President Reagan called the scar of a wall. It was a bit of a walk down memory lane for me, or memory Strasse. You could say I saw a piece of history that I was a tiny little part of back in the late 1980s. There was a plaque honoring American troops who protected peace and freedom in Western Europe. I was proud to play that small role. I think it's indicative of the incredible important relationship between our two countries over decades and decades and decades and decades as we move forward together as well. As you said, Heiko, in a little while, I'll continue my visit here in Leipzig. We'll visit St. Nicholas Church, a sacred birthplace of German freedom. And I'll talk with some of the brave demonstrators who, 30 years ago, helped bring down the wall that divided people. We'll then have a chance to visit the Halle synagogue, the site of the vicious anti-Semitic attack just last month on Yom Kippur, a sickening reminder of how there remains much work to be done, and the vigilance in the fight for religious freedom remains an imperative for each of our two countries. You know, the events of 1989 remind me of what binds us, our two countries, free societies, transatlantic allies, and friends. We share a strong belief in the rule of law and in democracy, human dignity, free speech, freedom of religion, and so many other unalienable rights, things we know to be central. These values link us together as people and as nations, and they define our foreign policy choices. Not all nations share these liberal values. I spoke last week in New York City about the nature of how Chinese Communist Party, China's governing entity, views the world, and we should speak frankly about such things. I know Germany, too, is facing its decision about how to handle its telecommunications network. This isn't just a simple decision. It's complicated, but it comes in the face of the challenges that are presented by the Chinese Communist Party. Heiko and I spent a fair amount of time this morning, as he said, talking about Syria. The United States will continue to monitor the ceasefire and hold human rights violators there accountable. We're investigating allegations of war crimes, and we'll continue to deliver on our humanitarian mission there. And we'll keep urging Russia and Turkey and the regime and its allies not to take steps that would further destabilize that already difficult region that has caused the mass displacement and refugee flows that we have already seen. I know, too, that Germany prides itself on being an important and valuable multilateral partner, and I express my deep appreciation for Germany's commitment to multilateral efforts that are in both our interest as well as in Europe's interests. Germany's been a great partner in supporting our efforts to attempt to denuclearize North Korea. You've maintained pressure on Russia to meet its commitments to implement the Minsk agreements. You've stood alongside the United States and many European partners trying to achieve democracy in Venezuela. And in September, you stood along with France and the United Kingdom in ascribing responsibility for the Iran attacks, or for the attacks by Iran on Saudi oil facilities. Each of these issues has at its core the mission of protecting unalienable rights and human dignity, something that communists of East Germany failed to do for so many years. I look forward to working with you, Heiko, to protect our shared values. There's no better way to do that than to be here to remember the victory of 1989. Heiko, thank you for hosting me on this very memorable visit. I will certainly never forget it. Thank you.
There's time for a couple of questions, and the first one is coming from the Agence France Presse.
Vielen Dank erst einmal an Heiko für Ihre Gastfreundschaftlichkeit.
Mr. Secretary, you mentioned the events in northern Syria. The French president, in an interview that he gave, declared that NATO was brain dead, and the Chancellor strongly rejected that statement. Do you do that too? And a question addressed to the Secretary. Mr. Pompeo.
Und was kann getan werden auf beiden Seiten, um
I'm sorry, what was the second question?
zu stärken?
I didn't get the second question.
Die zweite Frage war ja auf Englisch. Also die Worte des französischen Präsidenten, dass das hier Hirntod ist.
So, I think you asked that in the right context. There we were in this place where nations of democratic values worked so closely together for a long time to achieve what happened in 1989 and then again in 1990. Remarkable work that created freedom and brought millions of people out of very, very difficult situations. I think NATO remains an important, critical, perhaps historically one of the most critical strategic partnerships in all of recorded history. It's why when you hear President Trump talk about the fact that we need to make sure that every nation shares that burden, that every nation works alongside. It's why I welcome the comments from AKK, who said we're prepared to do this by 2031 to get to the Wales Commitment by 2031. I'm happy to hear that. It's that relationship. It is that NATO alliance that is so central, so important, and it's why it is an absolute imperative that every country participate and join in and contribute appropriately to achieving that shared security mission.
No, I do not believe that NATO is brain dead.
Ich glaube fest an die internationale Zusammenarbeit,
in
vor allen
international
Dingen, weil wir uns
cooperation.
immer mehr
Also and above all, because we are increasingly facing challenges of a global character, and NATO is the alliance in which we cooperate on security policy issues. Our core interest is to guarantee our security interests in Europe, and NATO does just that. And this is why we are grateful to our American partners for their contribution to Germany's and Europe's security. Together, we have to make sure that the alliance continues to cooperate in the face of a number of difficult tests we've been put to. The challenges should not be downplayed in their importance, those that we are facing. But we have an interest in the unity of NATO and its ability to take action. We should all have that very interest.
Thank you. We're going to have Tracy Wilkinson, LA Times.
Hi, yes, thank you. For Minister Maas, you mentioned Ukraine. As it struggles to fight both corruption and Russia, do you feel like Ukraine suffered a setback with what happened in Washington and vis-a-vis Ukraine, the Trump administration's actions this year? And Mr. Pompeo, Secretary Pompeo, you have said that Ambassador McKinley did not make known to you his objections over the recalling of Ambassador Jovanovic, but he has testified that 3 times he directly appealed to you to make a statement in her support. You did not. Why not?
Go ahead, Heiko.
We believe that there is a very positive momentum in Ukraine right now, which began with the election of President Zelensky. And this is why we intend to support President Zelensky in his endeavors. He has 2 priorities, the first of which is fighting corruption. Over the past few years, Germany has already supported the Ukraine with 1.5 billion euros, and we will continue to support projects in Ukraine that are being set in motion as part of the reform agenda. His second priority is to achieve peace in Donbass, and here too we have no...
Well, thanks for bearing with us. We wanted to take that press conference there from Berlin with the US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and his German counterpart because we wanted to hear Mike Pompeo's reaction to several things. French President Emmanuel Macron has described the NATO alliance as brain dead due to a lack of US leadership. The Secretary of State addressed that just a few moments ago. And earlier in the day, Mike Pompeo had been tweeting about Iran, saying that Iran's plans to increase its nuclear activity raised concerns that it's positioning itself for a rapid nuclear breakout. It's now time, he said, for all nations to reject its nuclear extortion and increase pressure. As yet, this press conference hasn't touched on Iran. Let's get some reaction to what we've just heard now, or some analysis, rather, from Al Jazeera's Alan Fisher, who's been listening in Washington. What do you make of it, Alan?
Actually, Adriana, I'll be interested to hear what Mike Pompeo's got to say about the question on Ukraine, because he's been directly asked why he may have misled the American people, because someone said...
Ukraine. Well, what happened in Washington this year was that we provided $250 million worth of security assistance, defense assistance, and $140 million or so of additional security assistance, just like happened in fiscal year 18 and fiscal year 17. And the United States' efforts to continue to fight corruption continued throughout this year. So that's what happened in Washington with respect to Ukraine this year. And I think that's important, because here I sit in Europe, a place that understands deeply the challenges of corruption in Ukraine, who talks about those risks to Europe incessantly and properly and importantly. And our administration, too, in the United States, has been very worried about Ukrainian corruption. It's been something that's been at the center of the State Department's mission set, and something that we worked last year and we will work again in the year ahead, trying to make sure that President Zelensky has the opportunity to root out corruption inside of his own country. And as for Ambassador McKinley, I clearly follow this a lot less than you do. I haven't had the chance. It's a pretty busy world out there. I haven't had a chance to follow this. But with respect to Ambassador McKinley, I think he said at the opening statement that he put out that he wasn't particularly involved in the Ukraine file. So it's not surprising that when Ambassador Yovanovitch returned to the United States, that he didn't raise that issue with me. It shouldn't surprise anyone that in May, when that took place, he didn't say a thing to me.
Okay, thanks. Next.
OK, let's go back to Alan Fisher in Washington. That was the answer you were waiting for, Alan. What did you make of that?
Well, that's going to be interesting, because that links into impeachment. Any time a senior official in the US administration is asked about Ukraine, you know that the underlying question is, what about impeachment? And certainly the question there was that Donald Trump said, as one point in his defence with Ukraine, he was holding back money because others weren't doing their share. And the German foreign minister is saying, look, we put in 1.5 billion euros, so we were. The question about the ambassador in evidence said that 3 times he'd said to Mike Pompeo, you need to put out a statement supporting the ambassador that was being recalled by Donald Trump, at the behest of Rudy Giuliani and others, and Mike Pompeo saying there that it was never raised. So that's very interesting. To go back to the original question that you asked about Iran, certainly Mike Pompeo thinks there is a window of opportunity here. We know that they pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal because they wanted to force Iran back to the table to restart negotiations, something the Iranians have always been vehemently opposed to, and certainly something that the European allies have said that they are not interested in doing at the moment, because they see Iran very much in compliance with what was agreed. However, there is some concern among European allies that Iran is stepping up its nuclear activity. And so Mike Pompeo sees a very small window of opportunity here where he can perhaps push some of the waverers in Europe to back their campaign of maximum pressure to try and force Iran back to the negotiating table. He already believes that there is certainly pressure on the banking and oil sector. We know about the sanctions that are being imposed by the US. This is now about a diplomatic push. So he is saying, look, there is a window of opportunity here, and that is why he is making the statements he's making, particularly in Europe, to Europe, to try and get them to alter their position on Iran and add even more pressure onto the government in Tehran.
All right, we'll stay listening to that press conference in Berlin. We'll bring you anything newsworthy that comes out of it. Al Jazeera's Alan Fisher reporting live from Washington. Alan, many thanks indeed.